The Blood Knot. The Blood Knot. And it's about two brothers in that segment of our society called the colored people, people of mixed racial descent. And as tragically happened very often to families in that group, one brother can be born, or one sibling can be born dark-skinned, and another one can be white. White enough to try to pass for white. And that is the temptation that is faced in that society, in that group of people, in those years. And my play, which was really written not so much to, but then this has happened with so many plays I've written, not written so much to make a comment about or to say something about the racial tensions in my country. It was written to explore the relationship with my elder brother, about whom I felt very guilty because I was the smart one in the family, and his name was Athol Fugard. Royal struggled very hard with his education and then subsequently with his attempts to get work and things like that. And that is what The Blood Knot was about. And it's a play as I first wrote it, which is flawed enormously by a young man's enthusiasm for language. It's grossly overwritten as first written. It has now been pruned down, and there's a very, very good the soul of the play lives now in a very severely edited version of the play. And that is the one I did at the Signature Theatre, for example, in New York, at the opening of their first season in that wonderful new premises they have. A very important moment in my life. I had written The Blood Knot. I had just come back from London, where the play was presented, and where Kenneth Tynan, the great ruling god of English theatre, tore the play to pieces. Oh, he hated it. And I came back licking my wounds. I mean, I always say now, God bless Kenneth Tynan, because he's in his grave and I'm writing a new play, so the scores are leveled. He couldn't understand what the fuss was about, because he wouldn't have any problems if his daughter married a black man. I remember that was one of the lines in the review. But anyway, I came back to Port Elizabeth, and I was working on my next play, which went on to be written, and one I'm very, very fond of, called Hello and Goodbye. And one night there was a knock on my door, and into my life trooped 5 black people from the black ghetto of Port Elizabeth called New Brighton. And they had come to ask me, they'd read about me and my success in the local newspaper, and they'd come to ask me if I would help them start a theatre group. At first, I thought, God, no, the last thing I want to do is train untrained, teach people how to act or what theatre is about. I'm a writer. I just want to write my play. But my guilty liberal conscience got the better of me, and I said, all right, let's try something. And that started a very, very important and defining period in my life when I realized, because at that moment, the apartheid laws were all powerful in the country. And one of the consequences of it was there was a silence. Free speech did not exist. It's as simple as that. The Americans cherished free speech. We knew nothing about that. If you spoke up too loudly about the injustice or anything like that, you were in trouble. And what those 5 people taught me as we began to work together then was that theatre was a way of breaking that conspiracy of silence, that you could use the stage to talk about things that would have landed you in trouble if you talked about them openly and publicly in any other context. As it turned out, there were consequences because although the police had already targeted me to a certain extent as being a liberal, a dreaded word in South African politics in that period, the black people were defenseless. I was protected by my white skin. And a large number of my actors were arrested during, not a large number, about 5 or 6, were arrested during rehearsals and carted off to Robben Island. We just kept on working because by then also my plays were starting to be recognized abroad, particularly in America, and the publicity associated with my name began to act as a defense against official action against me. Some plays of mine were banned. A play of mine called Busman and Lena, which got published in South Africa and then ended up being banned, and libraries were told, believe it or not, to burn. School libraries were told to burn the copies of the book. And another play of mine, which is arguably one of my most successful in terms of the frequency with which it is done, is called Master Harold and the Boys. And that was also landed me briefly in trouble until we discovered loopholes in the law which allowed us to proceed with performances that they hadn't anticipated and hadn't been plugged up yet, closed. Please, and I mean this very honestly, I'm not a brave man. I'm not. That's the last adjective that should ever be used in terms of me. But when your conscience forces you to do something, no matter how frightened you are of doing it, you sometimes get around to doing it. And that is the way it was with me. It happened shortly, very early in my young years, that the policies of apartheid were defined, put onto the law books, and those 40 years of darkness, because that's the only way to describe them, as one law after another went onto the statute books of our parliament, defining the privileges that went to the white people, and what was left over went to the people of color in my country. Even though the white population at that point was only a few million, and that the people of color in my country, black and, as we named them, colored, numbered over almost 25 million people. So it was a grossly, grossly unfair period, and it was very dark. Those were cruel, draconian laws that really stifled free speech, free assembly, defined who your friends could be, defined who you could marry, who you could have as a partner. It was unbelievable. I mean, it was rightly likened in some respects to the worst aspects of Hitler's period in Germany. It was an institutionalized form of race prejudice. That's what it amounted to. There was a law, quite simple, called, and I wrote a play about it, called the Immorality Act. And a white person was not allowed to have any sort of physical or sexual relationship with a person of color. It was as simple as that. And there was a special branch of the police who was, who implemented that law and who arrested people and sent people to jail. It was awful. The privileges that came to you by benefit of having a white skin ranged from your education to your health care to everything. All the privileges that were denied to the others came to you simply by virtue of having a white skin. There was a piece of legislation called the Job Reservation Act, which meant that certain categories of work in the country were reserved for whites. There was another act called the Group Areas Act, which meant that the best parts of the country were reserved for white occupancy. You could build houses there, but no white colored person or African person could build there. Those townships, as we called them, or locations, it was also a South African word, were always on the periphery of the big cities. And although we depended very, very much on them as a labor source to keep our country ticking over, they had to travel miles and miles every day of their lives to get into the city where they could work, where they would work for us. At the core of my life is a magnificent woman, my mother, an Afrikaner, almost illiterate. When it was a case of writing letters to our debtors, I used to have to sit down with pencil and paper, and she would tell me what she wanted to say to them and how she was going to ask for more time before we had enough money to pay this bill or that bill. And that lady, my mother, as to this very day, last night I spent a lot of time thinking about her, was gifted with a natural sense of justice. She looked, as ill-equipped as she was by any intellectual standards, to recognize what was happening in the country. She knew that something was wrong, that injustice was rampant. And because I was very close to both my mother and my father, she shared her probing questions with me, and in this way shaped my awareness of the world in which I was growing up. She had all sorts of jobs to start with, but she ended up with a little boarding house in a side street in Port Elizabeth called the Jubilee Residential Hotel. But it was it wasn't as splendid as its name, believe me. And that was the source of the family income for many, many years. And then eventually she moved out of boarding houses because we had ended up having two, alternately. And then she got hold of the license to a little tea room in a park in the center of Port Elizabeth called the St. George's Park. And that then became the family's source of income. That play is most probably, up to that point, the most nakedly autobiographical play I had ever written. Because that little schoolboy in the tea room on that rainy afternoon, when his company is the two black servants who work in the tea room, that whole setting comes directly from my youth. I used to go to a school, and after school I would come back to that tea room. I mentioned it earlier. It's the tea room my mother ran in the St. George's Park. And there was Sam and Willie. And I was this very pompous a little schoolboy who had learnt wonderful things that day at school and wanted to show off and also wanted to be a writer. I was already writing, filling school books with stories that I made up and things like that. And to my lasting shame, that moment, that shocking moment in the play where that little boy spits in Sam's face, that happened. That was me. And yes, nakedly autobiographical. His mother is on the telephone saying that his father, who complicates his life enormously because he both loves and hates. It's one of those double bind situations. And his mother's on the telephone to say that his father, who had been tucked away safely in hospital, leaving the house calm and quiet at home, was coming back, was being discharged from hospital, and that is when the little boy can't cope with the confusion of emotions, the conflicting emotions he has in his head, and he turns nasty, as people do when they lose control of any situation. And he has a ready-made target for his juvenile form of venom, which is the black man, the beautiful black man, Sam Samila. I'll never forget his name, because he was so beautiful. He was the father I wanted. A decent, good man, generous, full of laughter, caring. Not that my father was not caring, but it wasn't the same thing. He was a flawed human being, and Sam was. But how can a white boy in the apartheid years have a surrogate father, as a black man as a surrogate father? Absolutely impossible. It's, And so that's how the play shifts once those telephone calls build up and that agitation in him begins to take over. The sad ending to that story was that I eventually wrote the play, and Sam Samila, who was passionate about ballroom dancing, was living in that black township I mentioned earlier, the black ghetto, New Brighton. And Sam was alive, and I was going to do the play in Johannesburg. And I'd arranged for Sam to be flown up to Johannesburg so that... And I think that if he had sat and seen that play, I wouldn't still be feeling as guilty as I do now. But the truth is, Sam died a week before coming up to Johannesburg. My father was a jazz musician. He was also a cripple. I know that's not a polite word to use in terms, but he walked with crutches. But he was a wonderful pianist. And he had a band of his own called the Melodians. And he also had a problem in terms of alcohol. And very early on in my childhood, my father just sort of gave up on life and just left the breadwinning to my mother. And he just sat on the sidelines and waited very patiently for his end. It came when he was about, I think he was 71, when finally all sorts of things started to go wrong with him physically, and he died in hospital. Yeah. My full name is actually Harold Athol Fugard, which suggests an Irish connection, which was very definitely there. And the memory I have of storytelling and the power of storytelling, because that is how I think of myself, as a storyteller. I tell stories. I tell stories about people. And my dad was always in pain because of what we called his gammy leg. And sometimes in the middle of the night, I would hear him groaning in bed because of the pain. And I would crawl out of bed, light a candle, and sit at his bedside and massage the leg. And in return for that, he would tell me stories, tell me the potted versions of the great books, the wonderful books he had read as a child, because he was a great reader, he was an avid reader. And I think that, and the Irish connection gave him a gift with language, just as he had a gift with the keyboard of a piano. And I think that's really where it all started, just listening to his stories and acquiring, I suppose, my first sense of what storytelling involved and how to do it, how to hold on somebody's attention and build it up to a climax, all of which were very, very good lessons for the playwright I went on to try to be. The family were returning, when he was still a little boy, were returning from a visit overseas to the English branch of the family. and he fell down a stair, what do you call the gangplank on board a ship, and damaged his hip severely. But they were out at sea, and in those days, there was no sort of helicopter to come and pick you up or anything like that. And by the time they got to Cape Town, they docked in Cape Town, the damage had been done, very serious damage had been done to his hip. And that leg got progressively shorter and shorter, and so eventually crutches became his mode of transport. I was a student at the University of Cape Town. I was a good student. I must say that my writing always paralleled everything else that I was doing in life. It was always there, scribbling away at stories and notebooks and all of that. And I was at the University of Cape Town studying philosophy and anthropology and social economics. I was a good student. I got class medals in all my subjects at the university. And I was in my third year when I realized that I had a sense that completing that degree that I was studying for, a Bachelor of Arts degree, was a trap. And it was a very, very difficult decision to make on my side, because my mother had scraped together as much cash as she could to get me into university. Because she singled me out as someone who was going to compensate for the frustrated ambitions in her own life. She invested in me. And I was at university, and I sensed that that getting this degree was potentially a trap to me as a writer, because in addition to enjoying my work in philosophy and all of that, there was the writer in me. And I wrote to my mother, who had really struggled to get me to university, and I said, "Mom, I'm not going to take my degree. I want to be a writer, and I am leaving the university because writers have to see the world." I still remember using that phrase, writers have to see the world, and so I'm going to see the world. And after all the sacrifices she had made in order to get me at university, she wrote back to me and said, she was in Port Elizabeth, I was in Cape Town. She wrote back to me and said, "Hallie," because that was my nickname as a child, "Hallie, if that's what you must do it." Her faith in me was extraordinary and incredibly motivating in all the years that were to come ahead of me. I left university. I stayed around in Cape Town for a little while trying to sort out my head, and then decided the best way to see the world is to start traveling. So I hitchhiked up through Africa, Cape Town to Cairo, standing on the side of the road, thumbing lifts when they came along, because sometimes, you'd wait on the side of that road for days in the middle of nowhere, the Belgian Congo or the Sudan or Kenya, Tanganyika, and then eventually Cairo. And I eventually landed up after quite a lot of trouble, because I sneaked into Egypt. I jumped the border. I didn't have a passport. And they sent me back to the Sudan. And Sudan, I found my way down to Port Sudan. And I was just frittering away time there, wondering what next. Do I stow away on board a ship? When I happened to meet the captain of a tramp steamer. Those were the days of tramp steamers still. The world of Joseph Conrad, Youth, and all those magnificent novels of his. He said he was the captain of a ship, a tramp steamer, that was taking a load of salt to Japan, and would I like to go along for the ride. So that was the start of my seafaring career. And when I came out of that eventually, I realized I had to get back to my country, to my people, and which I did. And I worked as a journalist for a few years with the Broadcasting Corporation of South Africa, South African Broadcasting Corporation. But that urge to try and really make my way in the world solely on the basis of my own creative writing was very, very urgent and very strong. And I eventually left that job with the SABC, as they were called, and one lucky break after another, and I've been incredibly lucky in my career. One lucky break after another led me to writing a few apprenticeship plays in Johannesburg, and then finally the important play, the play that in which the writing of which I realized had led me to discovering my own voice, because it's every writer has his or her own unique voice, and in writing The Blood Knot, I knew I had found my voice, and from then on, I regard what I call my apprenticeship period, out of which came two plays, one called No Good Friday, the other called Nongogo, both plays that required just exclusive African actors. My apprenticeship, my masters in my apprenticeship were the great American playwrights. Tennessee Williams, Eugene O'Neill, Arthur Miller, you name them. Somehow I learnt the craft of playwriting, because it's a craft. It's a little time mechanism that you wind up and put on a stage, and it runs for 90 minutes, and then the little mouse stops running around. And I learnt my craft. Profound debt of gratitude I have to America at so many levels of my life. Thanks to America nowadays, I earn enough, and it is America that has, made it possible for me. The generosity and the perceptiveness of Americans, because somehow I think the magic was that the South African situation, the problem of race, is something Americans know only too well, all about. And I think that is the bridge which allowed them to enter into and engage with my writing. I've studied nothing except writing. No, I just had a flair for it, just a flair. And in those days in South Africa, also, I had to go it alone, because there was nobody ever thought that a South African story was worthy of a stage. You must understand, if it wasn't George Bernard Shaw or Oscar Wilde or Shakespeare or Marlowe or one of the great English playwrights, the stage belonged to those wonderful names from English theatre. And the South African story just didn't make sense at all. Until, of course, with The Blood Knot, because South Africans responded to the play in a very, very powerful way. And so did the critics. Well, firstly, I think for Americans, again, that bridge I mentioned earlier between the American experience of race, it's, the Civil War fought over race, slavery, what have you. That helped Americans at one level to identify. But then I suppose the story just of childhood and confusion and how easily you can lose your way in life in a moment of confusion. And I think that's one of the reasons why that story to this day still works. It gets, as I said before, that is one of my most successful plays. It gets done again and again and again and again, and thank God for that, because that keeps me going. But I never really quite work out how audiences receive and take in a play, and Either embrace it or reject it. Embrace the experience or reject the experience. And I think, thank goodness for that. I have no formulas for success, none at all. All I've learned is to try and be honest on the page. That's all I know about. Well, there's a moment in the writing of Master Harold and the Boys which possibly touches on this question of how do you watch what is happening on the page. Now, when I got to the moment where Hallie, as he's called in the play, spits in Sam's face, I had reached the point where I was going to define that moment with a stage direction. And I remember putting down, and this is a very precise memory because it was so important to me, putting down my pen and thinking, oh, for God's sake, Athol, as I then called myself already, you're not going to be as ugly as that. Heavens, man, there's some other way of dealing with this moment and bringing it to a climax. No, you can't possibly have a little boy spitting in a black man's face. And suddenly I said to myself, you're censoring yourself. You are censoring yourself. There are enough people in the government who are trying to do that to you. Put that pen back on the page and write those unspeakable words. Hallie spits in Sam's face. Close brackets. Carry on writing. And it is that awareness, because there's a part of you as you're writing. It's this strange sort of dualism you have in your relationship to the page. Sometimes, you're always watching what happens. Part of you is watching that part of you which is engaged in the story and telling it. And then there's this other part that is watching what the storyteller does and checking him out. It can be very exhausting, and there comes a moments in the writing of any play where you just wish, oh, for God's sake, do I have to go on? Can't I just push this aside? And, but you get back to it, and there's one sort of touchstone. If you know what you've put on that page is truthfully how you feel, what you understand about a character you're writing about, if it rings true, that's the only yardstick I've got, is to try. I've phrased it once or twice in interviews as saying, attempting to be a truly honest witness that will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. The South Africa of my childhood is, well, before that miracle that happened in 91 when the then Prime Minister of South Africa stood up in Parliament and announced that he was unbanning an organization that had represented the aspirations of the black citizens of my country. He was unbanning it, and was also going to be releasing Nelson Mandela from his 27 years in prison. And Nelson came out of that prison, and the new South Africa, as we now call it, was born. I was in the country, and, the build-up to it had been going on for many years. Somehow or the other, the writing was on the wall. South Africa, you cannot go on being an example of institutionalized race prejudices. Radical change has to happen. And the pressures on South Africa were very considerable. I mean, there were boycotts in terms of sport. There were economic boycotts. The South African economy was going downhill very fast. So even the die-hard in the ranks of the then government realized there've got to be changes. And there had also already started to be secret encounters, hush-hush encounters between the Afrikaner government and the African National Congress in exile. They had been meeting and feeling each other out in parts of Africa where, where it was possible to sit down and talk. And so that pressure really, it didn't come as all that great a surprise, but yet it was unbelievable that the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, F.W. de Klerk, could stand up in Parliament and say, the ANC, African National Congress, is being unbanned, and we are considering and looking at the date for releasing Nelson Mandela from prison. It was the start of a period of euphoria for all of us in the country, black, white, and coloured. I mean, those 5 years of Nelson Mandela's presidency, and I always think that one of the tragedies of South Africa's recent history is that Nelson didn't serve a second term, because he just did the first 5 years. On the day that we had to vote in our first ever free and totally open general election, I was one of the people that stood in a queue miles long as we shuffled towards the voting booths. And for the next 5 years, it was a question of, my God, the miracle, because it was rightly described as a miracle. A little nation that had become the sort of polecat of the world, is that the classic example of prejudice, had turned itself around 180 degrees, formulated a constitution which is recognized as one of the most extraordinarily liberal in the Western world to this day, granting freedoms to every conceivable group based on race, color, or creed, sexual preference, all of those covered up, looked after in this constitution. And for 5 years, I know I was once talking to a group of foreign journalists in Johannesburg during that very period, the general election and the formation of the first government. And I remember saying, and it was a silly thing to say, but I remember saying that I felt that I was now going to be South Africa's, because of the changes, first literary redundancy. My job as a playwright was over and done. I couldn't have been more wrong, of course, because to this day, after Nelson went, things became very, very shaky. And at the moment, we are living with a situation in South Africa which at times feels like such a betrayal of all that we fought for. Under President Jacob Zuma, attempts are being made to muffle the press. Rights are being tampered with, and even our cherished constitution is being eyed, and attempts have already been made to try and manipulate it and change it. Now, these are difficult times in South Africa, testing times. The background to victory is that it is set, and there's a period in my writing where I wrote a string of plays based on set in the little village where I have my home in South Africa now, called New Bethesda. And I have a home there together with Paula. And that little house has been burgled, I think about 7 or 8 times in the course of the past few years. And in fact, when we started rehearsals on The Shadow of the Hummingbird in Cape Town, my caretaker in New Bethesda phoned me to say that the house had been burgled again. And so that's experience. But gave me those succession of robberies and burglaries, uh, gave me the kernel of a play in which I also wanted to explore and make people understand what is it that drives people to, if they have no other options in life, who's to say they are wrong to break in and steal a loaf of bread if their family is hungry? Because crime is a very serious issue in South Africa today, very serious, and not in any way under control yet. And Victory gave me a chance of exploring that side of the situation in South Africa. And then in the presence of the old white man, whose house has been, he comes home to find the robbers in his house, gave me a chance to explore the incredible and marvelous heritage that goes with the concept of liberalism. You know what I mean? Education. And the balance between those two, that dynamic between the liberal white man and his cherished books and his beautiful little house, which is sort of like a little shrine to enlightenment, and these two young people, bewildered, lost in a world which offers them nothing, gives them no hope. To live without hope is the fate of a lot of people in South Africa. The social reforming that was necessary has not taken place. Millions of my fellow South Africans, black and coloured, live in appalling conditions, in squalor, no water. Oh, it's awful. And we just are not putting our hands on the problem and truly trying to deal with it. I'm writing The Blood Knot, but I'm also, based on the experience I have had in Johannesburg, where a set of, again, lucky coincidences led me to forming a friendship with a group of extraordinary young black intellectuals, who in turn introduced me to the world of Sapphire Town and that whole world where lost generations of young people form gangs and what have you. And I remember very clearly thinking to myself at one point, or maybe it's only now that I look back at it, that I think this thought, which is that, Tsotsi is not all that bad a novel, because I have dipped into its pages in the years since writing it. It's not all that bad a novel. Maybe you could have gone on to be a novelist. Whereas there was the fascination of the stage and the spoken language. Because, when you write a novel, it's that wonderful situation where you produce a work which is finally going to be dependent on one-on-one relationship between a reader and the words on the page. Whereas in theatre, it's not a one-on-one situation, it's the audience and the stage. And for better or for worse, for right or for wrong, I chose to pursue, although I did keep my hand in as a prose writer by way of my daily notebooks, and also by way of occasional short stories that I wrote. And I'm proud of all of that work, but my essential identity is that of the playwright. That is my profound gratitude to Gavin Hood, who directed it, and who had the uncanny ability to see that story, written right at the beginning of my writing career, portrayed a world that still exists now. and with minor adjustments, and with himself handling the screenplay, because I don't know anything about writing for the screen or television or anything like that. And I must admit that at first I didn't want to see the film, and he nagged and begged, and finally I was in San Diego at the time. He came to San Diego with the 2 or 3 reels of the film under his arm. He had rented a cinema for the afternoon so that he could put me down in a seat and say, "See it, and tell me if you approve." And I was blown away by what he did as a director. And I feel so sad that Gavin's not back in South Africa now doing another South African film and not living in Los Angeles. What the film portrayed? That's a hard one. Well, what it portrays, the central focus is on a group of young men, uneducated, what have you, who have come together and formed a gang, and who survive and live by way of robbing people, and that the leader of the gang is a traumatized, what appears to be psychopathic killer, who will single out his victim for the day's robbery. And then there is Butcher, who knows how to take a sharpened bicycle spoke and insert it just under a rib and push it up into a man's heart and stir it around, and he's dead before you know it. So it portrays actual situation that prevails in the townships today in South Africa. And that is what Gavin dealt with, and how that young man, this what seeming psychopathic killer, was actually traumatized in his youth by an experience, and who actually tries to redeem himself, because circumstances have involved him in ending up with a little baby, a botched robbery. He's got a baby who he tries to keep alive, and who in turn starts to work on him, the fact that there's a young life, and that leads to his attempt, well, as Gavin created it in the film, his redemption. Do I have a muse? Well, I don't know if this is an adequate answer, Gail, but I suppose my muse are the people of South Africa. You know, I've often said that the little, or maybe the lot, I know about loving and hating was taught me by South Africa. Now that's a big debt. When you owe that much to a situation that has shaped your conscience, your heart, your whole life, you're profoundly indebted. And, you know, as I walk around South Africa, I'll be back in South Africa sometime next week. I will see the stories on the pavements, stories that need to be told. It just goes on.